Murder in Midtown, the killing of Brian Thompson, and the trial of Luigi Mangione. Welcome to Behind the Crime, where true crime meets real life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Let's uncover the truth, one case at a time. Now let's see today's story. On the brisk morning of December 4th, 2024, Midtown Manhattan moved at its usual relentless pace. Office workers filed into skyscrapers, yellow cabs honked their horns, and tourists craned their necks to take in the seasonal window displays of Saks Fifth Avenue. It was the kind of morning that blurred into thousands like it, until the crack of a rifle split the air outside a coffee shop on Madison Avenue. The target was Brian Thompson, a 53-year-old senior executive at UnitedHealthcare, one of the largest health insurance companies in the United States. The shooter, police later confirmed, was a 27-year-old Brooklyn resident named Luigi Mangione. Within minutes, Thompson lay mortally wounded. A man whose name had been largely confined to corporate boardrooms now thrust violently into national headlines. The killing was brazen, chilling, and immediately polarizing. Was it an isolated crime by a disturbed young man, or a political act fueled by the simmering rage of millions over America's healthcare system? By nightfall, Mangione had been arrested, but the questions his act raised would ripple far beyond the boundaries of Manhattan. This is the story of two men, one a powerful executive, the other a struggling young man, and the tragedy that bound their names together. But it is also the story of a nation divided, grappling with the meaning of justice, the limits of protest, and the role of violence in an era of institutional mistrust. To those inside the corporate corridors of UnitedHealthcare, Brian Thompson was a consummate professional, sharp, ambitious, and skilled at navigating the labyrinth of America's healthcare industry. A graduate of the University of Minnesota with an MBA from Wharton, Thompson spent more than 2 decades rising through the ranks before becoming CEO of UnitedHealthcare, the company's core insurance division. Colleagues described him as pragmatic rather than visionary, someone who excelled at efficiency and execution. His role required balancing profit margins with patient outcomes, a task that often drew public ire. For critics, UnitedHealthcare epitomized corporate greed, denying claims, raising premiums, and squeezing patients and providers alike. Thompson, as one of its highest-ranking executives, became a public face of those frustrations. But outside of boardrooms, Thompson was not a symbol of corporate power. He was a husband, a father of 2, and a man with ordinary loves and quirks. He enjoyed jazz music, coached his son's soccer team, and was known among friends for his dry sense of humor. His widow, Catherine, would later insist that the world remember him this way, not just as an executive who was gunned down, but as Brian, who loved his family more than anything. That duality, Thompson as both man and symbol, would come to haunt his family in the months after his death. If Thompson's life was a portrait of corporate achievement, Luigi Mangione's was one of struggle. Born and raised in a working-class Italian-American household in Brooklyn, Mangione grew up in a tight-knit family where money was often scarce but love abundant. His parents were immigrants who worked long hours to give their children stability. Mangione, however, never quite found his footing. Friends recalled a young man who was bright but restless, bouncing between jobs in retail and food service, dabbling in community college, but never graduating. He spent hours playing video games, often slipping into online forums where political grievances and personal frustrations blurred. What united his struggles was a sense of being trapped. Medical debt, his own and his family's, was a recurring theme in conversations. One acquaintance remembered him railing against insurance companies after his mother's claim was denied for a critical treatment. Another recalled him muttering that executives live off our pain. Though Mangione had no prior violent record, Prosecutors would later argue that he had radicalized in private, stewing in resentment until it found a target. Brian Thompson, a symbol of everything he believed had ruined lives like his. After the shooting, chaos erupted on Madison Avenue. Witnesses ducked for cover, others fled, and within minutes the NYPD locked down the block. Surveillance footage captured Mangione fleeing the scene, rifle in hand. The manhunt that followed was swift. Within hours, tips poured in from residents in Brooklyn who recognized him. By evening, police had tracked Mangione to a small apartment in Bushwick. He surrendered without incident, reportedly muttering only, "He deserved it," as officers cuffed him. The weapon was recovered, along with a notebook that prosecutors would later describe as containing anti-corporate rants. Though not affiliated with any formal extremist group, Mangione's writings painted a picture of someone consumed by rage at the healthcare industry and convinced that violent action was the only way to make a statement. His arrest set the stage for one of the most contentious trials in recent memory. The legal proceedings that followed were as much about ideology as about guilt. There was never much doubt that Mangione had pulled the trigger. Witnesses, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence made the facts plain. The question was how the law would interpret his actions. In New York State Court, Mangione faced 9 charges, including second-degree murder, criminal possession of a weapon, and reckless endangerment. The prosecution sought to frame the act as deliberate, premeditated, and motivated by an ideological grievance. They initially filed terrorism-related charges, arguing that the killing was designed to intimidate a civilian population or influence government policy. But Judge Gregory Caro later dismissed those terrorism counts, ruling that while the act was heinous, it did not meet the legal threshold for terrorism absent ties to a recognized extremist organization. That decision narrowed the scope of the state case, but did little to ease public debate. The U.S. Justice Department then filed its own indictment, charging Mangione with interstate murder and signaling intent to seek the death penalty. Federal prosecutors framed the act as an attack not just on one man, but on a sector critical to national well-being. The defense countered with a different story, that Mangione was not a terrorist, but a troubled young man pushed to the brink by debt, disillusionment, and untreated mental illness. They hinted at diminished capacity defenses and argued that the government was politicizing a tragedy. Thus, the courtroom became more than a site of legal argument. It was a stage for competing narratives about violence, justice, and America itself. The killing of Brian Thompson reverberated far beyond legal filings. For his family and colleagues, it was a personal tragedy. For the nation, it became a mirror reflecting divisions over healthcare, corporate power, and justice. The mid-2020s were a time of deep unease. The COVID-19 pandemic had left scars on the healthcare system. Inflation squeezed households. Millions remained underinsured or drowning in medical debt. In that context, Thompson's killing became more than a murder. It became a symbol seized upon by activists and politicians. Almost immediately, online forums lit up with memes casting Mangione as a modern-day Robin Hood striking at corporate greed. Small groups of supporters gathered outside court hearings, some holding signs reading, "Healthcare is a human right," and "Free Luigi." One supporter even dressed as the Nintendo character Luigi, turning tragedy into street theater. For these supporters, Mangione was not excused but reframed, an act of desperation that exposed a system pushing people to the brink. Others saw only danger. UnitedHealthcare employees wore black armbands. Politicians condemned the violence. Even advocates for healthcare reform drew a sharp line. "You can't kill your way to better healthcare," one senator declared. For Thompson's widow, the folk hero narrative was unbearable. Her husband, she insisted, was a man, not a symbol or scapegoat. The media amplified the divide. Cable news debated whether Mangione was a terrorist, a vigilante, or just a man who snapped. On social media, hashtags like #FreeLuigi and #JusticeForThompson trended side by side, creating echo chambers of competing narratives. For those struggling with debt, the story resonated uncomfortably. They did not condone the killing, but they recognized the anger. Healthcare workers, however, saw danger in glorifying violence. If an executive could be gunned down and lionized, what would stop threats against doctors or nurses? Thus, Mangione became less a person than a symbol, a vessel onto which the nation projected its anxieties and hopes. Amid the headlines and debates, two families bore the true cost of violence. Brian Thompson's widow, Catherine, suddenly became a single parent to two children, ages 12 and 14. Their grief, once private, was thrust into the public eye. Cameras camped outside their home. At his funeral in St. Patrick's Cathedral, hundreds gathered, but for Catherine, the scale of the event only deepened the ache. Her children struggled with whispers at school and memes glorifying the man accused of killing their father. One son asked her, "Mom, why are people saying he's a hero?" She had no answer. For Luigi's family in Brooklyn, the ordeal was one of shame and disbelief. His parents, hard-working immigrants, could not reconcile the son they knew with the man accused of murder. Neighbors avoided them. Relatives cut ties. His mother, however, visited him faithfully, insisting that they don't see his heart. But not all relatives agreed. Some publicly disavowed him. The family was torn between shame, loyalty, and despair. At court hearings, the two families sometimes sat just yards apart, one grieving a husband and father, the other clinging to a son facing life in prison or worse. Neither spoke to the other, but both were bound by the same tragedy. The killing forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about healthcare and the roots of violence. America's healthcare system had long been plagued by high costs and inefficiencies. UnitedHealthcare was, for many, a symbol of denied claims and financial ruin. Thompson became a lightning rod not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. Psychologists describe the path to violence as grievance, blame, and action. Mangione's grievance was personal debt. His blame fell on corporations. His action was catastrophic violence. But why do millions with similar grievances suffer quietly, while some lash out? History is full of individuals targeting symbols of hated systems. Yet systems endure. Individuals perish. Thompson's killing did not lower premiums or change policies. If anything, it hardened corporate defenses and public polarization. The dismissal of terrorism charges underscored the legal dilemma. How should the law treat lone actors who commit violence for ideological reasons? Too broad an interpretation risks criminalizing dissent. Too narrow risks ignoring the message such acts send. Ultimately, the act underscored the futility of violence as reform. Healthcare costs did not fall. Executives became more fearful. Nurses reported more anxiety. The message that spread most effectively was not one of reform, but of fear. By early 2025, the case remained far from resolution. Mangione still faced 9 state charges, including second-degree murder. Prosecutors emphasized premeditation. The defense hinted at diminished capacity. The trial promised to stretch into 2026. The federal indictment raised the stakes, with the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors painted the act as an attack on an essential industry. The defense accused them of politicization. For Catherine Thompson, the road ahead was endurance, shielding her children, bracing for years of proceedings. For the Mangiones, it was dread, facing the possibility of life imprisonment or execution for their son. The divide persisted. Protests, and counter-protests continued. Online, debates raged. The broader questions about healthcare, corporate power, and violence remained unresolved. What ultimately is the legacy of this tragedy? A father and husband was lost, a family shattered, another family plunged into shame. At the center of all arguments were ordinary people, forever scarred. The case tested the limits of terrorism statutes, raising enduring questions about how America classifies politically tinted lone wolf violence. Mangione's folk hero image, however fringe, revealed the depth of disillusionment. At the same time, the backlash warned of the dangers of romanticizing violence. Despite heated debates, no sweeping healthcare reform followed. Security increased. Rhetoric hardened. In politics, the legacy was inertia. Perhaps the truest legacy was the mirror the case held up to America. A nation where millions feel abandoned, where symbols replace people, and where violence threatens to masquerade as protest. Years from now, the trials will conclude. Verdicts will be read. But for the families, grief and shame will endure. And for the nation, the questions will linger. What does it say about America that two strangers, a healthcare executive and a struggling young man, could become bound forever by a single gunshot? Thank you for staying through to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel now, and also feel free to comment and make a suggestion about anything or any story of your interest.